Imagine standing before a colossal stone head, weighing 20 tons, carved with such precision that its features seem almost alive. Now, imagine this. It was created over 3,000 years ago, without metal tools, without the wheel, and without any written instructions we've ever found. Who created these giants? And more importantly, why? The year was 1862. A plantation worker in the Mexican state of Veracruz was clearing land in the dense jungle when his machete struck something hard. Assuming it was a boulder, he began digging around it. But what emerged from the earth that day would eventually rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient American civilizations. It was a face, a massive, perfectly carved human face staring up from beneath centuries of soil and vegetation. For decades, this discovery was largely ignored. The academic world was fixated on the Maya and the Aztec, civilizations that left behind pyramids, cities, and hieroglyphic texts. But this mysterious head, it didn't fit into any known historical narrative. It would take nearly 70 years before archaeologists would finally understand what they were looking at. Evidence of a civilization that predated the Maya by over 1,000 years. A civilization so advanced, so influential, that it would lay the foundation for every major culture that followed in Mesoamerica. They called them the Olmec. In the Aztec language, this means rubber people, a name given centuries after the Olmec had vanished, referring to the rubber-rich lands where they once thrived. But here's what will surprise you. We still don't know what they called themselves.
Around 1600 BCE, while the Egyptian pharaohs were building their temples along the Nile, something extraordinary was happening on the other side of the world. In the tropical lowlands of southern Mexico, along the Gulf Coast, a people began organizing themselves in ways never before seen in the Americas. The landscape they chose seems at first glance utterly unsuitable for civilization. The region is a maze of swamps, rivers, and lagoons, sweltering under tropical heat and drenched by seasonal floods. Jaguars prowl through the jungle. Crocodiles lurk in the waterways. The humidity is suffocating. Yet the Olmecs saw something others might have missed: opportunity. The rivers provided transportation networks. The fertile floodplains, when properly managed, could yield abundant crops. The forests offered timber, medicinal plants, and game. And beneath the earth lay deposits of basalt, jade, and obsidian, materials that would become the foundation of their artistic and technological achievements. By 1400 BCE, the Olmec established their first major center at a site we now call San Lorenzo. This wasn't just a village. It was a planned urban complex covering nearly 2 square miles, with a population that may have reached 13,000 people at its peak. Think about that for a moment. While much of Europe was still in the Bronze Age, scattered in small tribal communities, the Olmec were engineering massive earthen platforms, creating sophisticated drainage systems, and organizing labor forces capable of moving stones weighing several tons across miles of difficult terrain. But San Lorenzo was just the beginning. Let's return to those massive stone heads, because they represent one of the most baffling achievements in ancient American art. To date, archaeologists have discovered 17 of these colossal heads across various Olmec sites. Each one is unique. Each one depicts a different individual, with distinct facial features, expressions, and elaborate headdresses. The smallest weighs 6 tons. The largest? A staggering 40 tons. Now here's where it gets interesting. The basalt used to carve these heads didn't come from nearby quarries. The nearest source of this particular type of stone is in the Tuxtla Mountains, over 50 miles away from San Lorenzo. In some cases, the stone had to be transported over 80 miles. Remember, the Olmec had no wheeled vehicles, no beasts of burden, no pulleys as we understand them. So how did they do it? The most likely explanation involves rivers. The massive basalt boulders were probably rolled onto wooden rafts, then floated downstream during the rainy season when water levels were highest. Teams of workers would have guided these rafts through treacherous currents, across swamps, and finally to the ceremonial centers where master carvers awaited. The carving process itself would have taken months, perhaps years. Using only stone tools and abrasives like sand, sculptors meticulously shaped each head, creating remarkably lifelike portraits. Some scholars believe these heads represent Olmec rulers, kings whose faces were immortalized in stone to project power and authority long after their deaths. But there's another theory, one that's more intriguing. What if these heads represented successful ball players?
The Mesoamerican ball game is one of the oldest organized sports in human history, and the Olmec invented it. Archaeologists have found the earliest known ball courts at Olmec sites, dating back to around 1400 BCE. These weren't casual playing fields, they were elaborate architectural complexes with sloped walls, sometimes decorated with intricate carvings and aligned with astronomical precision. The game was played with a solid rubber ball, sometimes weighing up to 9 pounds. Players couldn't use their hands or feet, only their hips, thighs, and forearms to keep the ball in motion. The objective varied, but generally involved getting the ball through stone rings or into specific zones. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds like an exhausting workout, and you'd be right, but this was no recreational activity.
Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo experienced a catastrophic decline. The monuments were systematically destroyed, the colossal heads toppled, sculptures defaced, and eventually buried in carefully arranged patterns. Was this conquest by enemies? Internal revolt? A religious transformation that required the destruction of old symbols? We don't know. The Olmec left no written records to explain their actions. But from San Lorenzo's ashes rose an even more impressive center, La Venta. Located on an island in a coastal swamp, La Venta became the beating heart of Olmec Civilization for over 400 years. The site's centerpiece was a massive earthen pyramid, rising 110 feet above the surrounding landscape, the earliest known pyramid in Mesoamerica. But calling it just a pyramid undersells its significance. The entire complex at La Venta was laid out according to a precise north-south axis, aligned 8 degrees west of true north. Every major structure, every plaza, every monument was positioned according to this orientation. Why? Theories abound. Some researchers believe it aligned with important astronomical events. Others suggest it pointed towards significant geographical features, like distant mountain peaks. What's certain is that this alignment was deliberate, replicated across multiple Olmec sites, and later adopted by the Maya and other Mesoamerican civilizations. At La Venta, the Olmecs created massive offerings, elaborate underground deposits containing hundreds of carved jade objects, polished mirrors made from iron ore, and carefully arranged serpentine blocks. In one extraordinary find,
archaeologists discovered 16 jade figurines arranged in a scene, as if participating in some ritual or council meeting. These weren't casual burials. The jade alone represented immense wealth and labor. The stone had to be imported from Guatemala, over 250 miles away. Each figurine required hundreds of hours of skilled craftsmanship. The message was clear. Whoever created these offerings commanded tremendous resources and wanted to communicate with powers beyond the physical world.
If you want to understand the Olmec, you need to understand their relationship with the supernatural. Because for them, the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was paper-thin and constantly being crossed. The Olmec cosmos was populated by powerful beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal. Their art depicts extraordinary hybrid creatures, were-jaguars with snarling fangs and clawed hands, serpents with feathers, beings that combine human intelligence with predatory animal power. The jaguar held special significance. As the apex predator of the Mesoamerican jungle, the jaguar embodied strength, stealth, and the mysteries of the night. Olmec rulers claimed descent from jaguars, believing this divine ancestry granted them the right to rule and the ability to transform into jaguar form during shamanistic rituals. Imagine the psychological impact. A ruler emerging from a temple during a torchlit ceremony, wearing an elaborate jaguar mask and costume, moving with predatory grace, growling and roaring before thousands of assembled people. In that moment, he wasn't representing the jaguar spirit, he had become it. This concept of transformation, of shamanistic power that allowed movement between worlds, would become fundamental to all later Mesoamerican religions. The Olmec also developed one of the first rain deity cults in the Americas. In their tropical homeland, water meant everything. Too little brought drought and starvation. Too much brought floods and destruction. The Olmec depicted their rain god as a supernatural infant with jaguar features, often shown crying or with a downturned mouth, sometimes holding what appeared to be corn plants or agricultural symbols. Ritual bloodletting played a central role. Rulers and priests would pierce their tongues, earlobes, or genitals with stingray spines or obsidian blades, offering their blood to sustain the gods and maintain cosmic balance. This wasn't simple superstition, it was considered essential to the continued functioning of the universe itself. No blood offerings, no rain. No rain, no crops. No crops, civilization collapses. The stakes in their worldview couldn't have been higher.
Here's where the Olmec story becomes even more remarkable. They may have invented writing in the Americas. In the 1990s, archaeologists working at a site called Cascajal discovered a stone block covered with 62 distinct symbols arranged in horizontal rows. Dating to approximately 900 BCE, this Cascajal block represents the oldest known writing system in the Western Hemisphere, predating Maya hieroglyphs by several centuries. The symbols include representations of objects like corn, fish, and insects, alongside more abstract geometric designs. While we cannot yet read this script, there's not enough material to crack the code. Its existence proves that the Olmecs were experimenting with visual communication systems that could record language, ideas, or historical events. They were also mathematical pioneers. The Olmec developed one of the world's first systems using the concept of zero, an intellectual achievement that occurred independently in only a few ancient civilizations. This mathematical sophistication allowed them to make precise astronomical observations and create complex calendars.
The famous Mesoamerican long count calendar, later perfected by the Maya, has its origins in Olmec timekeeping systems. A stone monument from the Olmec site of Tres Zapotes bears a date in this calendar system, proving that by 31 BCE, and likely much earlier, the Olmec were tracking time in cycles spanning thousands of years. Think about the mentality this requires. Conceiving of time not as a simple linear progression of days and seasons, but as vast, interlocking cycles of creation and destruction, of cosmic ages that rise and fall according to divine patterns. This worldview, this way of understanding humanity's place in an enormous cyclical cosmos, would define Mesoamerican thought for the next 2,000 years.
The Olmec didn't exist in isolation. They built something unprecedented in the ancient Americas, a vast trade and influence network that stretched from central Mexico to modern-day El Salvador. Olmec traders carried jade, obsidian, and magnetite mirrors along established routes, exchanging these luxury goods for cacao, feathers, and other exotic materials. At sites hundreds of miles from the Olmec heartland, archaeologists find distinctive Olmec-style pottery, sculptures, and architectural features. But this wasn't colonization in the way European empires would later practice it. The Olmec seem to have spread through cultural influence rather than military conquest. Local elites in distant regions adopted Olmec artistic styles, religious iconography, and architectural techniques, perhaps to associate themselves with Olmec prestige and power. Perhaps because Olmec traders brought not just goods, but ideas. One of the most fascinating examples comes from Chalcatzingo, a site in the highlands of central Mexico. Here, carved into living rock, we find unmistakably Olmec-style reliefs showing elaborately dressed figures seated in cave openings, surrounded by swirling clouds and rain symbols. Local rulers commissioned these carvings using Olmec artistic conventions to legitimize their authority and connect themselves to Olmec cosmic power. This pattern repeats across Mesoamerica. The Olmec became what historians call a mother culture, not because they were ancestral to all later peoples, they weren't, but because their innovations in religion, art, architecture, writing, and mathematics provided a common foundation that subsequent civilizations built upon, adapted, and transformed. Without the Olmec, there would be no Maya, no Zapotec, no Teotihuacan, no Aztec. Every pyramid, every ball court, every divine king claiming supernatural authority, every calendar tracking the movements of Venus, all of it traces back to innovations pioneered by this first great American civilization.
Around 400 BCE, something catastrophic happened to Olmec civilization. La Venta was abandoned. The magnificent monuments were ritually buried or destroyed. The trade networks collapsed. Within a few generations, the Olmec heartland returned to jungle, and the civilization that had dominated Mesoamerica for over 1,000 years simply vanished. What happened? Environmental collapse is one possibility. The intensive agriculture required to support large populations may have exhausted the soil. Deforestation could have led to erosion and flooding. Climate change might have brought prolonged droughts or altered river patterns crucial for transportation and irrigation. Others point to warfare. Competition between rival Olmec centers could have spiraled into destructive conflicts that weakened everyone. Or perhaps neighboring peoples, having learned Olmec techniques and technologies, rose up to challenge their dominance.
There's also evidence of volcanic activity during this period. A major eruption could have devastated agricultural lands, triggered famines, and shattered faith in rulers who claimed divine power to control nature. Or perhaps the answer is more subtle. Maybe Olmec civilization didn't collapse so much as transform and disperse. Their people didn't disappear. They merged with other groups, carrying Olmec knowledge, beliefs, and practices with them. The civilization ended, but its ideas lived on, embedded in the DNA of every culture that followed. The truth is, we don't know. And without written records explaining their perspective, we may never fully understand what brought down America's first great civilization. But here's what we do know. The Olmec fundamentally transformed the human landscape of the Americas. They proved that complex civilization could flourish in tropical environments previously considered unsuitable. They created art of stunning sophistication without metal tools. They developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that rivaled any civilization of their era. And they did it all centuries before classical Greece, centuries before the Roman Empire, during an age when most of Europe was still pre-literate.
If you made it this far, you're clearly a history lover like me. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next documentary. What lost civilization should we explore next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.
What if I told you that while Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages, a civilization in Central America was calculating the movements of Venus with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the invention of modern computers? What if I told you they built massive stone pyramids without metal tools, without the wheel, and without beasts of burden? Yet their structures still stand today while countless modern buildings have crumbled. The Maya weren't just another ancient civilization. They were mathematical geniuses, astronomical wizards, and architectural masters who created one of the most sophisticated societies the world has ever seen. And then they vanished. This is their story. It's roughly 2000 BCE. In what we now call Guatemala, Belize, and Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, something extraordinary is beginning. While the pyramids of Egypt are already ancient history, a new power is emerging in the dense rainforests of Mesoamerica. But here's what makes the Maya different from every other civilization you've learned about in school. They didn't build their empire in a fertile river valley like the Egyptians along the Nile, or the Mesopotamians between the Tigris and Euphrates. They conquered one of the most hostile environments on Earth, a thick jungle where it rains half the year and there's drought the other half, where jaguars prowl and deadly snakes hide in every shadow. And they didn't just survive there, they thrived. The early Maya weren't the pyramid builders we imagine. They started as simple farmers, cultivating maize, beans, and squash in small villages. But around 1000 BCE, something changed. These scattered communities began organizing into something far more complex. By 400 BCE, cities were rising from the jungle floor. Nakbe, El Mirador. These weren't primitive settlements. El Mirador's La Danta Pyramid Complex is one of the largest structures ever built in the ancient world, with a volume greater than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let that sink in for a moment. We're talking about a structure built entirely by hand, without metal tools, in the middle of a rainforest over 2,000 years ago. But here's where it gets fascinating. Unlike the centralized empires of Rome or China, the Maya never unified under one emperor or king. Instead, they created a network of independent city-states, each ruled by a divine king called a Kuhul Ahol, literally divine lord. These kings weren't just political leaders. They were seen as living gods who could communicate with the supernatural realm. Now pay attention to this because it's going to blow your mind. The Maya developed the only fully developed written system in the pre-Columbian Americas. We're not talking about simple pictograms or basic symbols. This was a complete written language with over 800 distinct glyphs combining phonetic and logographic elements. While medieval Europe was largely illiterate, Mayan scribes were documenting everything from royal genealogies to astronomical observations to mathematical calculations. They wrote on bark paper, carved into stone, and painted on pottery. They recorded their history, their mythology, their science, and their daily lives. And here's the tragic part. Spanish conquistadors and priests burned almost all of it. Today, only 4 Mayan codices survive. 4. Imagine if only 4 books survived from all of European history. That's what we're working with. Between 250 and 900 CE, that classic period, the Maya reached heights that would make modern city planners jealous. We're talking about cities with populations exceeding 100,000 people. Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan. These weren't just ceremonial centers. They were bustling metropolises with complex water management systems, paved roads, markets, ball courts, and soaring temple pyramids that dominated the skyline. Let me paint you a picture of Tikal at its peak around 700 CE. You're standing at the base of Temple 4, which rises 65 meters into the sky. That's as tall as a 20-story building. The city sprawls across 130 square kilometers, home to perhaps 100,000 souls. Markets bustle with traders selling jade from the highlands, cacao from the coast, obsidian from distant volcanoes, and colorful feathers from exotic birds. Nobles draped in jaguar pelts and jade jewelry parade through plaza ceremonies. Priests wearing elaborate headdresses perform rituals atop pyramid temples. Common people fill the streets, farmers, artisans, merchants, and warriors, all speaking in the musical tones of classic Mayan. Here's something you might find shocking. The Maya played a ball game that was part sport, part religious ritual, and possibly part human sacrifice ceremony. Picture a mix between soccer and basketball, but played on a stone court with sloped walls, and the ball, made of solid rubber, weighed up to 4 kilograms. Players couldn't use their hands or feet. They had to keep the ball in play using their hips, thighs, and upper arms, often wearing protective padding. In some versions of the game, stone rings were mounted high on the walls, and getting the ball through the ring could end the game instantly. But here's the dark twist. In certain ceremonial games, the losing team, or possibly the winning team, historians still debate this, might be sacrificed to the gods. Imagine the psychological pressure of playing the game where the stakes aren't just victory or defeat, but life or death. Now let's talk about something that should make every math student pay attention. The Maya independently invented the concept of zero. Think about that. In Europe, zero wasn't used until it was imported from India via the Islamic world around 1200 CE. The Maya had been using zero for over 1,000 years by then. They developed a vigesimal number system, base 20 instead of our base 10, that was incredibly sophisticated. Using only 3 symbols, a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and a shell for 0, they could represent any number and perform complex calculations. Why does this matter? Because this mathematical prowess allowed them to create calendars of stunning accuracy. The Mayan obsession with time and astronomy borders on the supernatural. They didn't have telescopes, they didn't have precision instruments. Yet, they calculated the length of the solar year as 365.2420 days. our modern calculation? 365.2422 days. They were off by only 17 seconds per year. They tracked Venus so precisely that their calculations over a 500-year period were accurate to within 2 hours. They predicted solar and lunar eclipses. They identified the Milky Way as a cosmic river of stars and incorporated it into their creation mythology. The Maya used multiple calendars simultaneously. The Tzolk'in was a 260-day sacred calendar for divination and religious ceremonies. The Ha'ab was a 365-day solar calendar for agriculture and daily life. When combined, these created the calendar round, a 52-year cycle. But here's where it gets epic. They also used the long count calendar, which tracked time from a mythological creation date in 3114 BCE. This calendar could measure spans of millions of years. To put this in perspective, medieval Europeans thought the Earth was created around 4000 BCE. The Maya were thinking on geological timescales. Remember the 2012 apocalypse scare? That was based on the end of a long count cycle, a Baktun, on December 21, 2012. The Maya didn't predict the world would end. They simply marked the completion of a major cycle, much like we celebrated the year 2000. Let's return to their architectural achievements, because they deserve more attention. The Maya built structures that were aligned with astronomical events with incredible precision. El Castillo at Chichén Itzá, also called the Temple of Kukulkan, is a masterclass in astronomical architecture. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun creates a shadow pattern on the pyramid stairs that looks exactly like a serpent slithering down the structure. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional design work that required sophisticated understanding of solar movements and geometry. The pyramid has 365 steps, one for each day of the year. Each of the 4 sides has 91 steps, plus the top platform makes 365. The 9 terraces on each side, split by the stairways, create 18 segments, matching the 18 months of the Ha'ab calendar. Think about the planning required. Think about the mathematical precision. Think about the generational commitment to complete these structures without modern tools or equipment. But the Maya weren't just about grand pyramids and astronomical calculations. Let's talk about daily life in a Mayan city. Society was highly stratified. At the top sat the divine king and royal family, believed to have the blood of the gods flowing through their veins. Below them were nobles and priests who controlled religious ceremonies, warfare, and administration. Skilled artisans, sculptors, painters, potters, and weavers occupied a respected middle class. At the bottom were farmers and laborers, the backbone of Mayan society. Mayan beauty standards were unique, to say the least. They practiced cranial deformation, binding infants' heads between boards to create an elongated skull shape considered divine and beautiful. They filed their teeth into points and inlaid them with jade. They induced cross eyes in children by hanging objects between their eyes, as this was considered attractive. Tattoos and scarification marked status and achievements. Their diet was surprisingly sophisticated. Yes, maize was the foundation, so important it featured in their creation myth. But they cultivated dozens of crops, including cacao, which they turned into a bitter ceremonial drink reserved for nobility. They kept stingless bees for honey, hunted deer and peccary, and in coastal areas, exploited rich marine resources.
Here's where we need to shatter a myth. For decades, archaeologists believed the Maya were peaceful astronomers and philosophers, unlike their warlike neighbors. This romantic notion has been completely demolished by modern archaeology. The Maya were absolutely engaged in warfare. Frequent, brutal, and systematic warfare. City-states competed for resources, trade routes, and prestige in conflicts that could span decades or even centuries. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul, two superpowers of the classic Maya world, played out like an ancient Cold War. These cities didn't just fight each other, they built networks of allies and vassals, manipulating smaller city-states into their spheres of influence. Wars were fought not just between the two giants, but by proxy through their allies across the Maya lowlands. Mayan warfare had a specific purpose that distinguished it from European military campaigns. They didn't seek to occupy territory or impose direct rule. Instead, they aimed to capture enemy nobles, especially kings, for ritual sacrifice. The prestige of capturing an enemy ruler and publicly sacrificing him validated the victor's divine right to rule and humiliated the losing city. Imagine the psychological warfare. You're not just fighting for survival or conquest, you're fighting to avoid being dragged back to your enemy's city, displayed before jeering crowds, tortured, and finally sacrificed to top a pyramid as your blood is offered to their gods. Speaking of blood, we need to address one of the most misunderstood aspects of Mayan culture: ritual bloodletting and human sacrifice. The Maya believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create humanity, and humans owed a blood debt in return. Blood was sacred, containing the essence of life force, or chulel. Offering blood maintained cosmic order and ensured the sun would continue to rise, the rains would fall, and crops would grow. Nobles regularly performed auto-sacrifice, bloodletting on themselves. Kings would pierce their tongues or genitals with stingray spines, drawing blood onto bark paper, which was then burned as an offering. Queens passed thorny ropes through their tongues. These weren't one-time events, but regular religious obligations. Human sacrifice, while real, wasn't as common as Hollywood would have you believe. It was reserved for special occasions, major victories, coronations, important astronomical events. Captive enemy nobles were preferred victims, though slaves and sometimes volunteers were also sacrificed. The methods varied: beheading, heart extraction, arrow sacrifice, or being thrown into cenotes, natural sinkholes. At Chichén Itzá's sacred cenote, archaeologists have recovered bones of dozens of sacrificial victims, along with jade, gold, and other precious offerings thrown into the waters. Let's return to something crucial. Literacy and writing weren't universal skills in Mayan society. They were concentrated among the elite, royalty, priests, and specialized scribes. This gave the ruling class enormous power because they controlled the narrative. Mayan writing on monuments primarily served as propaganda. Stelae, tall stone slabs covered in glyphs, were erected to commemorate royal achievements, military victories, and astronomical events. They established genealogies connecting kings to gods and legitimized their rule. When archaeologists finally cracked the Mayan writing system in the 1950s through 1980s, yes, it took that long, a whole new history emerged. Suddenly, the glyphs weren't just decorative. They told stories of specific kings, named real battles, recorded actual dates, and revealed political intrigue that had been hidden for over 1,000 years.
Now we come to one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Why did Maya civilization collapse? Between 800 and 900 CE, something catastrophic happened. One by one, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands were abandoned. Not destroyed by invaders, not burned by revolution, simply abandoned. In Tikal, construction stopped. The last dated monument was erected in 869 CE, and then silence. Copan's final dated monument appeared in 822 CE. Across the region, elite activities ceased, monumental construction ended, and populations plummeted by up to 90% in some areas. People didn't just move, they disappeared. Millions of people gone. The jungle reclaimed the cities, wrapping pyramid temples in roots and vines, turning grand plazas into forest floors. What could cause such a total societal collapse? Modern research suggests it wasn't one cause, but a perfect storm of interconnected disasters. First, drought. Climatological studies of lake sediments and cave formations reveal that between 800 and 1000 CE, the Maya region experienced the worst drought in thousands of years. Not one drought, but a series of multi-year droughts that devastated agriculture. For a civilization dependent on rain-fed maize cultivation, this was apocalyptic. Crop failures meant starvation. Starvation meant desperation. The divine kings who promised to intercede with the rain gods couldn't deliver. Their legitimacy crumbled. Second, environmental degradation. Population pressure had pushed Mayan agriculture to its limits. They had cleared vast swaths of forest for farmland and to make lime plaster for their buildings, a process requiring enormous amounts of firewood. Deforestation led to soil erosion, reducing agricultural productivity precisely when they needed it most. Third, warfare intensification. As resources became scarce, competition between city-states intensified. The archaeological record shows increasing fortifications and evidence of violence in the decades before collapse. Wars disrupted trade networks and agriculture, creating cascading failures across the system. Fourth, political fragmentation. The elaborate system of divine kingship that had held Maya society together for centuries began to break down. When kings couldn't deliver rain, couldn't ensure harvests, couldn't maintain order, people lost faith. The social contract collapsed. Try to imagine what this collapse looked like on a human level. You're a farmer in a city that's been your family's home for generations. The rains haven't come for 3 years. Your maize crop has failed again. Your children are hungry. The king's priests promise that more sacrifices will bring rain, but the sacrifices continue and the rain doesn't come. Trade has broken down because neighboring cities are also starving. Warriors raid your fields for whatever crops survived. The elaborate water management systems that used to sustain the city through dry periods are failing without maintenance. Eventually, you make an impossible choice. You abandon everything your ancestors built and migrate away, searching for any place where survival might be possible. But here's the crucial point that often gets lost. Maya civilization didn't completely disappear. The southern lowland cities collapsed, yes, but the northern Maya and the Yucatan Peninsula continued to thrive for centuries more. Chichén Itzá rose to prominence after the classic collapse, becoming a major power from 900 to 1200 CE. Later, Mayapan dominated from 1200 to 1450 CE. Coastal trading cities like Tulum flourished into the Spanish conquest period. More importantly, the Maya people themselves never disappeared. They adapted, they moved, they rebuilt on a smaller scale. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they encountered thriving Mayan communities, not the ruins of a dead civilization. If you made it this far, you're clearly a history lover like me. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next documentary. What lost civilization should we explore next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.
It's November 8th, 1519. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés stands at the edge of a massive causeway, staring across the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco. What he sees defies everything he knows about the world. Rising from the lake like a fever dream is a city more magnificent than anything in Europe. Gleaming white pyramids, floating gardens, aqueducts carrying fresh water across impossible distances. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. A metropolis of 200,000 people, larger than London, Paris, or Rome. One of Cortés's soldiers would later write, "We were amazed. Some of our soldiers asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. And within 2 years, it would all be gone, reduced to rubble, its people decimated, its secrets buried beneath the stones of what we now call Mexico City." The Aztec story doesn't begin with empire. It begins with wandering, with prophecy, and with a vision so powerful it would drive an entire people across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The year is approximately 1100 CE. A semi-nomadic tribe called the Mexica, the people we would later call Aztecs, are leaving their mythical homeland of Aztlan. Nobody knows exactly where Aztlan was. Some scholars think it was in northern Mexico. Others believe it might have been in the southwestern United States. The Aztecs themselves described it as an island in a lake, a paradise they were commanded to leave by their god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of war and the sun. But here's what makes this journey extraordinary. Huitzilopochtli gave them specific instructions. He told them to wander until they found a very particular sign, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent. Only there could they build their city. Only there would they fulfill their destiny as the chosen people of the sun. For nearly 200 years, the Mexica wandered. They weren't welcomed anywhere. The established city-states of central Mexico saw them as barbaric outsiders, uncivilized nomads who practiced human sacrifice with disturbing enthusiasm. They were driven from place to place, sometimes enslaved, always despised. In one notorious incident around 1323, the Mexica had been allowed to settle near the city-state of Culhuacan. To cement the alliance, the Mexica asked the Culhua king for his daughter, ostensibly to become the bride of their chief. The king agreed. What happened next is almost too shocking to believe. The Mexica didn't marry the princess, they sacrificed her and flayed her skin. Then, during a ceremony to which they had invited the king, a priest wore his daughter's skin as a costume and danced before him in the firelight. The king, understandably horrified, drove the Mexica out with extreme violence. They fled into the marshes and swamps of Lake Texcoco, the least desirable, most mosquito-infested wasteland in the valley. Nobody wanted this land. It was where you sent your enemies to die slowly of disease and starvation. But the Mexica weren't just anyone. In 1325, somewhere in those miserable swamps, a group of Mexica priests saw it. On a small, muddy island, there it was. An eagle perched on a nopal cactus, holding a serpent in its talons. The prophecy had been fulfilled. They called their new city Tenochtitlan, place of the prickly pear cactus. And on that swampy, unwanted island, they would build something that would make the rest of the world tremble. Within 200 years, these despised outcasts would rule an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, commanding tribute from over 400 cities, controlling a territory of roughly 80,000 square miles, and presiding over a population of 5 to 6 million people. How did the most hated people in Mexico become its absolute masters? The answer lies in a combination of military genius, agricultural innovation, political cunning, and a religious worldview so intense it would fuel an empire, and ultimately contribute to its catastrophic fall. Let's talk about that swamp for a moment, because what the Aztecs did with it represents one of the most impressive engineering achievements in human history. The land was useless, flooded, salty, impossible to farm. But the Aztecs looked at this nightmare and saw opportunity. They invented a farming technique called chinampa, what the Spanish would later call floating gardens. Here's how it worked. They drove wooden stakes into the shallow lake bed and wove them together with reeds and branches, creating rectangular frames. Then they piled layers upon layers of mud, lake vegetation, and waste into these frames until they rose above the water level. They planted willow trees at the corners. Their roots would grow down and anchor the entire structure to the lake bed. The result? Incredibly fertile artificial islands that could produce up to 7 harvests per year. The constant moisture from the surrounding canals meant they never had to worry about rainfall. These chinampas were so productive that they could feed not just Tenochtitlan, but the entire Valley of Mexico. You can still see remnants of this system today in Xochimilco, south of Mexico City. Tourists take colorful boats through the canals, completely unaware they're floating through the remnants of of one of history's most sophisticated agricultural systems. But the Aztecs didn't stop with farming. They built massive causeways connecting their island city to the mainland, some over 3 miles long, wide enough for 10 horses to ride abreast. They constructed an aqueduct system that brought fresh spring water from the mountains directly into the city. They created a sophisticated grid of canals that served as streets, allowing canoe traffic to move goods and people throughout the metropolis. The main pyramid, the Templo Mayor, rose 90 feet into the air, dominating the skyline. Around it sprawled a city of white limestone buildings, painted murals, gardens and marketplaces. The central market at Tlatelolco was so large that Spanish observers estimated 60,000 people visited it daily. You could buy anything there: gold jewelry, jade carvings, exotic feathers from tropical birds, jaguar pelts, cacao beans, which served as currency, obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical steel, vanilla, chili peppers, tomatoes, avocados, and even live animals from distant regions. The Spanish were genuinely stunned. One conquistador, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, wrote, "When we saw all those cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land and that straight and level causeway leading to Mexico, we were astounded. These great towns and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream. But underneath all this beauty, all this sophistication, all this engineering brilliance, there was something else, something darker. To understand the Aztecs, you must understand their cosmology, their view of how the universe worked. And it was terrifying. The Aztecs believed they were living in the fifth sun, the fifth creation of the world. The previous 4 worlds had been destroyed by catastrophic disasters: jaguars devouring humanity, hurricanes, fiery rain, and floods. This current world, they believed, would also end, specifically by earthquakes and starvation. But there was a way to delay this apocalypse. The sun, Tonatiuh, was engaged in a cosmic battle every single day. Each night he descended into the underworld to fight the forces of darkness. Each morning he needed strength to rise again. Without that strength, the sun would fail, the world would end, darkness would consume everything. How do you feed a god? How do you keep the sun moving across the sky? With blood, human blood. The Aztecs didn't invent human sacrifice. It was practiced throughout Mesoamerica, but they industrialized it. They turned it into state policy on a scale never seen before. Here's where the story gets truly chilling. The Aztecs believed the most potent offering to the gods was the heart of a living human being, still beating, freshly torn from the chest. The victim would be stretched across a sacrificial stone. 4 priests would hold down the arms and legs. A 5th priest, using an obsidian blade, would make a deep incision beneath the ribcage, reach in and physically tear out the heart while it was still pumping. The body would then be thrown down the pyramid steps. In some rituals, the corpses were dismembered and eaten, not out of cruelty, but as a sacred act. To consume the flesh of someone sacrificed to the gods was to share in their divine essence. How many people died this way? The numbers are hotly debated. Spanish sources claim tens of thousands were sacrificed annually. Some accounts describe 80,000 victims sacrificed over 4 days during the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, though modern historians consider this number greatly exaggerated, possibly propaganda to justify Spanish conquest. More conservative modern estimates suggest somewhere between 1,000 to 20,000 sacrifices per year across the empire. Even at the lower end, we're talking about an industrial-scale religious killing operation. But here's what Western audiences often miss. From the Aztec perspective, this wasn't murder. This was cosmic necessity. The priests weren't serial killers. They were performing the most sacred duty imaginable. They were quite literally saving the world. Moreover, many sacrifice victims weren't unwilling. Being chosen for sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli or Tezcatlipoca was considered a tremendous honor. Warriors captured in battle knew that dying on the sacrificial stone guaranteed them paradise, a place in the highest heaven accompanying the sun on its daily journey across the sky. The Aztecs had a saying, "There is nothing like death in war, nothing like flowery death, so precious to him who gives life. Far off I see it, my heart yearns for it." This religious intensity permeated every aspect of Aztec society. Children were educated in warrior skills and religious devotion from an early age. Everyone had a role in maintaining the cosmic order, and at the center of it all stood the emperor. Not just a political leader, but a semi-divine figure whose power came directly from the gods. By the time Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, the Aztec Empire was at its absolute peak, wealthy, powerful, seemingly invincible. At its head was Montezuma II, the 9th emperor, a man whose name would become synonymous with the tragic collision between two worlds. Montezuma wasn't born to rule. He was a younger son, a high priest and military commander who seized power in 1502 through a combination of religious authority and political maneuvering. Under his rule, the empire expanded further than ever before, extracting tribute from hundreds of subjugated cities. But Montezuma had a problem, multiple problems actually. First, the empire was overstretched. Maintaining control over such vast territories required constant military campaigns. Subject peoples resented Aztec rule, particularly the demands for tribute and sacrificial victims. The Tlaxcalans, a confederation east of Tenochtitlan, had successfully resisted Aztec domination for decades and nursed bitter hatred toward their would-be conquerors. Second, strange omens had begun appearing. According to later Aztec accounts, admittedly recorded after the conquest and possibly influenced by Spanish interpreters, comets streaked across the sky. A temple spontaneously burst into flames and couldn't be extinguished. A woman's voice was heard wailing through the night. "My children, we are lost!" The waters of Lake Texcoco churned violently without wind. People saw visions of strange towers floating on the sea. Whether these omens actually occurred or were retrospective attempts to make sense of catastrophe, we can't know for certain. But we do know that in April 1519, Montezuma received disturbing news. Strange men with pale skin and beards had arrived on the eastern coast. They rode on animals like giant deer. They wielded weapons that produced thunder and lightning. They had floating temples that moved across the water with white wings. The Spanish had arrived. Montezuma faced an impossible choice. Ancient prophecies spoke of the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who had once ruled as a benevolent king before sailing away to the east, promising to return in the year one reed. In the Aztec calendar, 1519 was one reed. Montezuma did something that would prove fatal. He hesitated. He sent gifts, gold, precious stones, elaborate featherwork. He hoped to either appease these beings or learn more about their intentions. But those golden gifts had exactly the opposite effect. The Spanish saw the wealth and wanted more, much more. Let's be clear about who Hernán Cortés was. He wasn't a noble knight on a holy mission. He was a 34-year-old adventurer from minor Spanish nobility who had spent years in the Caribbean colonies accomplishing very little. He was in debt, restless, hungry for glory and gold. When the opportunity came to lead an expedition to the Mexican mainland, he grabbed it, even defying the governor of Cuba, who had ordered the mission cancelled. Cortés sailed with about 600 men, 16 horses, several cannons, and a handful of war dogs. By any rational calculation, this tiny force had no business conquering an empire of millions. But Cortés had advantages Montezuma didn't fully grasp. First, the Spanish possessed military technology that seemed like magic to the Aztecs. Steel swords, armor, crossbows, arquebuses, early guns, and most importantly, horses, animals that didn't exist in the Americas. The psychological impact of mounted cavalry charges on people who had never seen horses cannot be overstated. Second, the Spanish brought invisible allies, diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, epidemics that would eventually kill somewhere between 80% to 95% of the indigenous population. The first smallpox outbreak wouldn't arrive until 1520, but when it did, it devastated Tenochtitlan in ways that Spanish steel never could. Third, and most crucially, Cortés understood the empire's fundamental weakness. Everyone hated the Aztecs. As the Spanish marched inland, they encountered the Totonacs, who were paying crushing tribute to Tenochtitlan. Cortés convinced them to stop sending tribute and join him instead. Next, he reached the Tlaxcalans. After several fierce battles, the Tlaxcalans realized the Spanish could be useful allies against their ancient enemies. They joined Cortés, providing thousands of warriors, supplies, and crucial intelligence about Aztec military tactics. By the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, he commanded not just 600 Spaniards, but thousands of indigenous warriors eager to see the Aztec Empire fall. Montezuma, still paralyzed by uncertainty, made another catastrophic decision. He invited Cortés into the city as an honored guest. It was a trap that snapped shut on the wrong victim. Within days, Cortés had taken Montezuma hostage in his own palace, a prisoner in all but name, forced to rule as a Spanish puppet. For months, this bizarre situation persisted. Montezuma, held under guard by Spaniards, still commanded the empire. His people watched in confusion and growing anger. Then, in June 1520, everything exploded. What happened next is one of the most dramatic sequences in all of colonial history. While Cortés was briefly away from the city dealing with a Spanish force sent to arrest him, his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, massacred hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The reason? Alvarado claimed he had learned of a plot. More likely, he panicked or simply wanted to steal the gold the celebrants wore. The city erupted. The Aztecs, who had been growing increasingly hostile to the Spanish presence, finally struck back. They attacked the palace where the Spanish were housed, trapping them inside. Cortés raced back to find himself besieged in the heart of Tenochtitlan. The causeways, those magnificent engineering marvels, had become death traps. The Aztecs had torn up sections, leaving gaps that the Spanish couldn't cross. Tens of thousands of Aztec warriors surrounded the palace, and food and water were running out. In a desperate move, Cortés forced Montezuma to appear on the palace roof and beg his people to stop fighting. The response was heartbreaking. The emperor, who had once commanded absolute obedience, was met with stones and arrows. One struck him in the head. Within days, Montezuma was dead, killed either by his own people's projectiles or, as some sources suggest, murdered by the Spanish, who no longer had use for him. With Montezuma gone and the situation desperate, Cortés made the decision to escape. On the night of June 30th, 1520, a night that would be called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spanish attempted to flee the city under cover of darkness and rain. It was a slaughter. Aztec warriors in canoes attacked from the waters. Gaps in the causeway became mass graves as heavily armored Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies fell into the lake and drowned, weighed down by the gold they tried to carry. The Spanish lost perhaps 600 of their own men and several thousand Tlaxcalan allies. Those who survived that night told horrific stories. They described water choked with bodies, survivors clinging to floating corpses, the air filled with war cries and screams, the darkness lit by torches as the Aztecs pursued them relentlessly. Cortés himself supposedly wept beneath a tree after reaching the mainland, though whether from grief for his dead men or frustration at losing the city and its gold, we can only speculate. The Aztecs had won. The invaders had been driven out. Tenochtitlan was free again, but the victory would be short-lived, because Cortés carried something more dangerous than any weapon, a burning determination to return, and the knowledge that he now commanded thousands of indigenous allies who wanted the Aztecs destroyed. For nearly a year, Cortés regrouped. He built brigantines, shallow draft warships that could sail across Lake Texcoco, neutralizing the Aztecs' water-based advantages. He recruited more indigenous allies until his army numbered in the tens of thousands. And crucially, smallpox arrived. The epidemic hit Tenochtitlan like an atomic bomb. The new emperor, Cuitlahuac, died of the disease within months of taking power. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, whose name means descending eagle, inherited a city ravaged by plague, facing enemies on all sides. In May 1521, Cortés began his siege. This wasn't a quick assault. It was a methodical strangulation that would last 93 days. The Spanish brigantines controlled the lake, cutting off food and fresh water. Cortés systematically destroyed the aqueducts. His indigenous allies, now numbering perhaps 100,000 warriors, surrounded the city. Slowly, systematically, they advanced street by street, filling in canals, demolishing buildings to prevent ambushes, pushing the defenders back into an ever-shrinking perimeter. Inside Tenochtitlan, conditions became apocalyptic. The drinking water was contaminated, food ran out, people ate tree bark, leather, anything. The dead accumulated in the streets, victims of violence, disease, and starvation. The smell became unbearable. The Aztec defenders fought with stunning bravery. Cuauhtémoc, just 25 years old, led desperate counterattacks. Aztec warriors used guerrilla tactics, emerging from canals to attack and disappear. They captured Spanish soldiers alive, dragging them to the top of the pyramids where they were sacrificed in full view of their comrades. A psychological warfare tactic designed to break Spanish morale. But nothing could overcome the combination of disease, overwhelming numbers, starvation, and the systematic destruction of the city itself. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee by canoe. He was captured. The young emperor was brought before Cortés and spoke words that have echoed through Mexican history. I have done everything in my power to defend my kingdom and free it from your hands. Since fortune has not been favorable, take my life, for that would be just and it is the best thing you can do. Take that dagger you have at your belt and kill me with it. Cortés didn't kill him immediately. He kept Cuauhtémoc alive for several years, eventually hanging him in 1525 during an expedition to Honduras on suspicion of plotting rebellion. The siege had cost perhaps 100,000 lives, mostly Aztec civilians and defenders. The city itself was utterly destroyed. A Spanish soldier wrote, "I swear that all the houses on the lake were full of heads and corpses. I do not know how to describe it, but it was the same in the streets and courts. We could not walk without treading on the bodies and heads of dead Indians." The greatest city in the Americas, larger than any European capital of its day, was gone. In its place, the Spanish would build Mexico City, using the stones of demolished pyramids as construction material. If you made it this far, you're clearly a history lover like me. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next documentary. What lost civilization should we explore next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.